In 1795, in dozens of English towns, crowds walked into the marketplace, seized the sacks of grain, and sold them off themselves at the price they thought was fair. Then, often, they handed the money to the stunned dealer and went home. They didn't think they were stealing. They thought they were correcting a price that had broken a promise. To understand that promise, and why bread, of all things, could topple the public order, we have to watch what a loaf actually cost across 600 years. This is the long series. For most people across these 6 centuries, bread wasn't part of the diet. It very nearly was the diet. A labourer might spend half his income, sometimes more, on bread and grain alone. So the price of wheat wasn't a statistic. It was the line between a hard life and a hungry one. Here is that price, starting around the year 1300. And because everyone understood the stakes, bread was not left to the open market. From the 13th century, the Assize of Bread fixed the weight and price of a loaf to the local cost of wheat. When grain rose, the loaf got smaller or dearer by a public formula, not by a baker's whim. This was the promise, a just price, set in the open. Remember it. Then, across the 1500s and early 1600s, the price of grain does something it had never sustained before. It climbs and climbs, perhaps 5- or 6-fold in a century and a half. Silver pouring in from the Americas, a population recovering and pressing on the food supply. This is the same price revolution that, in our last episode, crushed the workers' wages. Here you see the other blade of the scissors, pay falling, bread rising at the same time. Now the line gets violent. Harvest fails and the price doesn't drift up. It spikes, sometimes doubling in a single bad year. Each of these spikes is a season when ordinary families simply could not afford to eat as they had. And it is against these spikes that the promise of the just price gets tested. The historian E.P. Thompson gave it a name, the moral economy. The crowd believed bread had a fair price, and that hoarding grain to sell it dearer wasn't business. It was a crime against the community. So when the price broke the promise, they enforced it themselves, seizing grain, setting their own price, sometimes paying the dealer the fair sum and leaving. Riot, yes, but riot with rules. In 1766 alone, this kind of action swept dozens of counties. But the age was turning. A new conviction took hold among those in power that the market, left alone, would feed people better than any old formula. Paternalism was out. Laissez-faire was in. The Assize of Bread was wound down, abolished in London in 1822, and across England by 1836. The public promise on the price of bread was quietly withdrawn, and it withdrew at the worst possible moment. War with France, blockade, fail harvest. And in 1795, and again in 1800 and 1801, the price of wheat rocketed to perhaps 3 times its ordinary level. This is the cold open. The crowds in the marketplaces, setting the price themselves because no one in authority would. The largest wave of food, rioting in English history, breaks across exactly these years. And then, slowly, the line comes down, and the riots fade with it. Better harvests, canals, and then railways, moving grain, and eventually the opening of cheap imported wheat. By the later 1800s, for the first time in this whole story, bread becomes something most English families simply do not have to fear. So this is the price of bread. Across 600 years, a quiet floor, a long climb, a century of violent spikes, each one a hungry season, and often a furious crowd. And then, at the very end, release. The riots were never really about theft. They were about a promise that the most basic thing a person needs would be priced fairly. Watching the price, you can see exactly when and how it was taken away. A new data story every week. Subscribe. Sources for every figure are in the description. Next time on the long series, how long people actually lived. 6 centuries of life expectancy, and the single change that doubled it. Thank you for watching. For